In the United States, a bipartisan study group has called for the return of war powers to the Congress.
A common theme runs through these efforts, and that is the importance of meaningful consultation between the President and Congress before the nation is committed to war. And that is what our Commission's proposed statute would accomplish. Promote meaningful discussion between the President and Congress when America's sons and daughters are sent into harm's way.
The group, co-chaired by former Secretaries of State James Baker and Warren Christopher, says the current law governing war powers has failed to promote cooperation between the executive and legislative branches. It released a report suggesting a new joint House and Senate committee should review the president's justification for war. The report calls the 1973 War Powers Resolution, passed in the wake of the Vietnam War, ineffective and unconstitutional. The panel studied the issue for more than a year after consulting dozens of experts. It also briefed the findings to the presidential campaigns of Barack Obama and John McCain. Now, for more on that story, we're joined by our own correspondent, Jihan Hafez in Washington. Jihan, so a U.S. bipartisan group is calling for better cooperation between the executive and legislative branches of the government before going to wars in the future. Does this conclusion or recommendation carry any weight? I mean, these findings are not binding, are they?
Well, they're not completely as far as legislation goes. This is actually the war report right here that was conducted for 13 months, like you mentioned, with experts, politicians, people who have been involved in the United States government for about 30 years. And essentially, if you can remember the Baker-Hamilton report in 2006, which was released shortly before the surge, the recommendations were to open up negotiations with Iran and Syria and settle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 2 years later, none of those recommendations have been applied. So like you mentioned, it's hard to see where this will go, if it will go anywhere. But the one point they did make was they want to revise the War Powers Resolution of 1973. They want to revise that for this year. At least they can balance the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of the American government. At least there can be checks and balances, like the Constitution stated when it was founded.
Now, Mr. James Baker has said, quotes, the biggest complaint of scholars, politicians, and policymakers was that the president did not consult with Congress before going to war. What do Americans think their president should do? I mean, don't they think it is common sense to consult scholars, politicians, and policymakers before engaging in a major conflict?
Well, yes, common sense says that about a world leader, especially a world leader as powerful as the United States president. And if you can remember when the Bush administration first came into power in 2000, a lot of his advisors, legal advisors, people around him, politicians that he listened to, are now either non-office, being subpoenaed by Congress, or are not in the scene at all. Karl Rove, Wolfowitz, we have Rumsfeld, Dennis Ross. Scott McClellan actually mentioned in his book that the Bush administration has been on this permanent campaign mode, which is obviously very true because they're not listening to public opinion, they're not listening to their close advisors. He's actually not even listening to Colin Powell, one of his former secretaries of state, who mentioned that withdrawal from Iraq is important for the war, for America's image to continue as it's been tarnished in the past couple of years.
James Baker also said the proposal was not intended to resolve constitutional disputes between the White House and Congress and who should decide whether the nation fights. What is it intended for then?
It's intended to restore checks and balances to the American government. Over the past couple of years, we've seen the executive branch of the American government abuse these powers through signing statements, through launching war preemptively. Of course, they did go to the Congress beforehand, but the bill that I mentioned before to you, the War Resolutions of 1973, is very vague, and it does not pinpoint where Congress, how Congress should be involved in sending troops overseas to engage in battle. And what he hopes to do with this is to restore that checks and balances to the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branch of the American government. And that's when this democracy was founded, that's how it was supposed to work. All of the articles of the U.S. Constitution state that the judicial branch of the government's there as the Supreme Court, Congress is here to represent the American people through representatives and through senators, and the president simply is the commander-in-chief. And those are all supposed to balance to make a workable democracy. Over the past couple of years, we've seen those diminished in the Bush in the Bush administration. So essentially, this panel, which is made up of very prestigious scholars, former secretaries of states, is saying, this time you should listen to us this time around and actually apply these methods and apply these reports that we've been working so hard on. We'll see where it goes from here, but until the next administration, we can't really say.
Finally, Jihan, a spokesman for Mr. Obama commended the panel for its proposal, but McCain has not provided any comment that does, well, this does seem to tell us a lot about the candidate's fervor for war, doesn't it?
It does. But also bear in mind, Senator Barack Obama is running a permanent image campaign. He, unlike Leahy, unlike Feingold, unlike Levin, he voted in 2002. He voted present when it was time to vote for war, whereas these other senators and these other congressmen voted against the war. And lately we've been seeing different rhetoric out of the Obama campaign. So it's very hard to tell right now, but he has to keep up this image of, yes, we have to restore American democracy, we have to, reinstall these balances in the American government. As for McCain's side, he has a lot of skeptics watching him right now. A lot of conservatives are still going along with this war, as he is. So he can't really judge on whether or not the executive branch should give more of its power back to Congress and back to the Supreme Court. But just one more comment. The bill that they're trying to pass, the War Powers Resolution Bill of 2009, will most likely not pass this year because it is the Bush administration. So what it has to do first is it has to go through a series of congressional hearings, it has to get marked up, and then it gets voted on, then gets sent to the White House. President Bush most likely will not vote to give balanced power to the Congress because seems like he's been enjoying a lot of it through signing statements.
Well, Jihan Hafez, I will have to leave it there. Our correspondent in Washington, Jihan Hafez, thank you for joining us.